Okay.
Okay, well, I want to welcome everyone to this very interesting webinar this evening. My name is Paul Shannon. I am a coordinator with the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. And this evening's webinar, we're going to learn a lot about Saudi Arabia, what it's up to in the world, and the impact that the US-Saudi alliance is having on a lot of people, as well as the strategy of an organization that's working on this issue and trying to stop foreign and international support for Saudi Arabia. The event tonight is sponsored by the Massachusetts Peace Action Mideast Working Group. And we're hoping that some of the participants tonight might be interested in participating in our working group. We are working to try to prevent new wars in the Middle East, to stop old ones. But our focus right now is primarily on trying to attack the sanctions that the United States is putting on a number of countries, including in the Middle East. That is just having devastating effects on the civilian populations of these countries. Sanctions has become a key tool now in strategy of regime change from Iran to Venezuela and over to Cuba and other places. And the other sponsor of our event tonight, besides the Massachusetts Middle East Working Group, is the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. And at the end, if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about the campaign and how you might get involved. Raytheon, of course, has all kinds of connections to Saudi Arabia that our campaign tries to bring out and tries to focus on as a way of forcing Raytheon to change its behavior. Okay, so we're very fortunate tonight to have Sunjeev Bery as our presenter. Sanjeev has quite a background. He's been regional director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California in the past. He's also has been the advocacy director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International, USA. But tonight, Sanjeev is speaking as the executive director of an organization called Freedom Forward, where he works to end US alliances with Saudi Arabia and other non-democratic governments, including dictators, kings, and apartheid systems. So he's got his hands full there. Sanjeev, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us here in Massachusetts. Sanjeev is speaking to us from Oakland, California.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks to Paul and Brian and Cole and everybody for having me on the call. You know, one funny consequence of making me the big window on the screen is that now I'm the big window for me as well. So let me just adjust that so I'm not having the weird experience of having a conversation with my own face. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. That's great. So I really appreciate having the chance to be here. And there's a lot I'm looking forward to sharing. There are also some things that I'm not the right person to share. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then get into the conversation, which I hope will actually be a conversation, because I find it much more interesting to hear other people's thoughts and concerns and focus areas and questions, because I think that's how we build movements. I will say that kind of as a tangent, I had the privilege of going to the Harvard Kennedy School for a mid-career master's, and while I was there, I studied a program of leadership called adaptive leadership, which is about dealing with big challenges and problems that no one quite knows the answer to, but that we know that we have to solve together. And you know, we're living through in many ways right now, right? Whether it's white supremacy and police violence, climate change, the capacity of a narcissist to take over the executive branch of our government, you know, the deep challenges across other societies. And one of the lessons I learned from that coursework was a very simple phrase, which is give the work back, which is share. We have to share the work together if we are to be a part of the solution. And so as much as, you know, the the culture sometimes is around experts giving talks on webinars and things like that. I'm much more interested in sharing some of my thoughts, but then also hearing yours, because I don't think that it's possible for any one organization or any small set of people with expertise to solve these problems unless we're working on this together. Um, so a little bit of background on me. You know, I was born and raised in the U.S. I'm a child of immigrants from India. My mom and dad came from India many decades ago. My dad grew up in relative poverty in Mumbai. My mom grew up in relative privilege, if there's such a thing for the youngest of 11 siblings. My dad was the oldest of 7. And through their stories of different sorts of hardship and challenges in India, and through my own experiences as a kid growing up in a relatively rural city called Modesto in the California Central Valley, I came to be raised sort of in the pre-internet era with a sense of, you know, belief in American democracy. You know, during the first Gulf War, people were tying yellow ribbons around trees, all this sorts of stuff that was going on in a relatively conservative town, even as I understood, you know, the struggles that my parents had growing up in, especially my father, in less fortunate circumstances. And then at some point in high school, I stumbled my way into an author, thanks to a Canadian cousin who was visiting, an author named Noam Chomsky, an author named Michael Parenti. You know, one of the first books that I remember going to this local bookstore in Modesto called The Bookstore, which sadly Barnes & Noble displaced, which probably will soon be displaced by Amazon. But I went to the bookstore, to the political science section, to find a book by somebody named Noam Chomsky. I didn't understand the Hebrew origins of the name, or the Jewish origins of the name. I found this book called Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies. And all of a sudden, the experience of sort of being a bit of an outsider in a relatively white rural city in California, along with the knowledge of my dad's struggles and being part of an international family with relatives in the US and Canada and India, collided with the sudden learning of all of the different ways in which our US government has historically intervened against communities and societies being able to solve their own problems. You know, overthrowing Iranian democracy, Guatemalan democracy, Chile, you know, putting a dictator in place in Indonesia, on and on and on. And that filled me with the sense of rage and injustice, because I could just imagine the number of people struggling under economic hardship, facing political barriers and oppression that prevent them from solving their own problems, thanks to oftentimes our own government, but by no means our own government alone. And so that kind of propelled me over the course of my life into this question of what the US is doing supporting dictatorships and interfering with democratization. Of course, today in the world, I think, and feel free to correct me if I'm incorrect, but I tend to perceive the Middle East as being the greatest concentration of US-backed dictatorships. Every single monarchy in the Middle East is backed by the United States. If you look at a map of US military bases, it's essentially kind of a ring of fire around the Middle East. You know, US media, in keeping with the kind of domestic systems of propaganda, focuses on the dictatorships that aren't US allies. Iran, which is semi-autocratic. I mean, it's not a democracy, it's not quite a dictatorship, or Syria, but very little mention of all of the monarchies historically that have been backed by the US. And so that brings me to Freedom Forward. And our goal is to build challenges to US foreign policy by mobilizing people across the US and by connecting people across the US with the diaspora communities inside the US and outside US borders who directly know what's happening inside the countries of origin, in sort of a global arc of solidarity to expand the space for freedom by pushing back against our government and other governments that stand in the way of freedom. Saudi Arabia is, of course, you know, one of several anchors of US foreign policy in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt's dictatorship, the other monarchies, they all play a role as being part of a US umbrella of power. And they play a role in keeping the US anchored in a posture of perpetual militarization, militarism, and war. You know, so if we want to expand the sphere of freedom and prosperity in the Middle East and elsewhere, we can do the most amount of good by pulling our own country and our own government out of these relationships that keep, you know, dictatorships and monarchies anchored with US support. You know, there's a certain power that a monarchy derives when it shows to its own people that it is backed by the United States. And there's a certain shakiness that comes into play for any monarchy when the US faces significant challenges to that backing. If it weren't for the Trump administration right now, there'd be much more space between the US and Saudi Arabia at this moment. But we can build the churning waters that might break through that dam as soon as that dam cracks, you know, whether it's after the next elections or beyond. So that's the big picture. And you know, the approach that we're building, and that's why I'm really happy to be on this call with all of you, is to take the sort of traditional human rights approach of lobbying governments and to link it to the lessons that were learned from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and other movements that made oppression expensive for everyone involved. The corporate sector, civil society organizations, private individuals, diplomats, on all fronts. And when we do that, you know, as it happened with South Africa, with the right kind of campaign, we can build a tremendous challenge that goes way beyond opposing any single arms sale or just lobbying a member of Congress or things like that. We can create an environment where everyone has to back away from the relationship in question. You know, one of the most powerful kind of political moments that I think back to, and I was of course too young to know this in real time, but it's thanks to searching the New York Times archives, which was, and folks on this call, you know, may well know this from personal experience, or may even have been a part of this reality happening, which was, of course, Reagan and Mr. Crocker had their policy of quote unquote constructive engagement, opposing any changes to the U.S. alliance with South Africa's apartheid government. Reagan opposed strong sanctions on South Africa. A Democratic House of Representatives passed a strong sanctions bill. The Republican Senate passed a strong sanctions bill. The Reagan administration vetoed it, and then the Democratic House and the Republican Senate overturned Reagan's veto. It's almost impossible to imagine a Republican Senate overturning a Republican president's veto, but it shows just how powerful that intersection of the global anti-apartheid movement with America's deep, painful history with slavery and white supremacy and racial subjugation, the effect of that combination on the US government. So that brings me to the question of Saudi Arabia. And, you know, folks on this call, you've been doing a lot of amazing work with the Raytheon campaign, with holding the arms industry accountable. And there's an opportunity here to bring a lot of things together in a way that I don't think is usually done. And that is because there are different angles of criticism and concern with regards to the US-Saudi alliance. And not all of them are fully overlapping. You know, it's a very imperfect Venn diagram with some overlap across some circles, but a lot of people kind of separate from each other. There are lots of people in the United States who are concerned about the treatment of women in Saudi Arabia. There are lots of people in the United States who are concerned about the particular strand of ideology and strand of Islam that the Saudi monarchy lifts up at the expense of other strands of Islam or other interpretations of Islam, including inside Saudi Arabia, where advocates for human rights and democracy anchored in an interpretation of Islam go to jail or are executed. There are lots of people, including many of us, who are deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, triggered in part by Saudi Arabia's mass bombardment armed by the US. There are lots of diaspora communities who grapple with the Saudi monarchy's interference in their countries. Egyptians who are upset about the Saudi monarchy propping up the Sisi dictatorship. Bahrainis who are upset about the Saudi monarchy sending the tanks in after the Arab Spring and protests there. Sudanese who are upset about the Saudi and UAE monarchies providing money and support to the quote unquote transitional military council, whose goal was probably to not be that transitional after Omar Bashir was removed from power. You know, and the list goes on and on. So there are a lot of different communities that are pretty deeply concerned in overlapping but not completely overlapped ways around the US-Saudi alliance. And we have an opportunity now this year to bring these different communities together through a set of interlocking campaigns. And the reason why is because Saudi Arabia is going to host, they are the quote unquote president of the G20 this year. They are the G20 president. And if it weren't for coronavirus, they would be hosting the G20 in November of this year, 2 weeks after our presidential elections, November 20th, 21st, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. They're not saying that they're not going to, but so it's still a possibility. And they want to reap the benefits of PR and legitimacy and the public spotlight by doing this. Let me, if we have a moment, I can switch over to a screen showing the Saudi G20 page to give people a sense of it. Do I have the ability to do that right now? Okay.
You should be able to share.
Okay, give me just 1 second here.
And if people have questions, by the way, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Try it now.
Okay, let's see here. Share screen, there we go. So this is the homepage for the Saudi G20. And as you can see, even just from the very beginning, you know, they are working really hard to promote themselves as some kind of global solutions, forward-thinking, glamorous, historical community. There's even a combating COVID-19 button on the left of the screen. And the G20 isn't just a one-time summit. It's a gathering over the course of the year of multiple groups that come together on different issues. And so let's see if I can pull it up. Show. G20 participants. Let's see if that gets to it. This is where my Wi-Fi connection battles between the Zoom call and the next page. So you'll see like the way they're positioning world leaders, and then also but what I wanted to point to is this right here, engagement groups. Because what the G20 is not just the world's wealthy countries, the political leaders of the world's wealthiest countries coming together for an in-person summit. It's also a group of engagement groups, the B20, the Business 20, the Y20, the Youth 20, Labor 20, Think 20, which is a think tanks collection, Women 20, Civil Society 20, and on and on and on, Urban 20, which is mayors from certain key cities. And so this is where the opportunity is to really start to shake things up and put pressure on the Saudi monarchy. So I'm going to jump over to another document. I apologize, there's a little background noise on my end. Let me know if it's coming through on the phone.
Seems to be okay.
Okay, great. So what Freedom Forward is focused on, and we'd love to work with all of you on, is to build a series of campaigns between now and November that participants to the engagement. Looks like my internet connection's a little unstable.
Your sound's a little unstable, Sunjeev. You might have to shut off your video if that happens.
Okay.
Save your bandwidth for your voice.
Sure, that's great. How is it right now?
It's okay right now.
Okay, let me know if it gets bad. So there are multiple companies from Boston Consulting, BCG, to McKinsey, to Cisco Systems, to Citigroup, that are advising the G20. They're knowledge partners. You know, they want to be making money off the Saudi relationship. There is a whole list of women leaders around the world, civil society representatives who are going to the G20. There are mayors who are participating in one way or the other historically. Let's see if they participate this year. There are civil society organizations that are participating in the G20. And through all of this, there are significant opportunities to push the companies involved to back away, and to do so with a sort of concerted campaign that calls on them to back off. And so we're starting to warm that up now. One example is that McKinsey, BCG, and Oliver Wyman are advising a Saudi construction effort to build a city from scratch where a tribal community already lives. And so we're just launching a campaign calling on these consulting groups to back off. But the ideal vision is to bring together a set of demands to all of the participants, whether it's McKinsey or or civil society organizations or women leaders that they should drop out of the G20, and that they should demand that the Saudi monarchy end its war in Yemen, stop imprisoning women's rights activists, and move down a list of human rights concerns and issues, from labor violations to the war in Yemen, to the spreading of coronavirus through the war in Yemen and the war in Libya, and on and on and on. And so together, ideally, we can bring together a set of different communities in the US, peace activists, diaspora communities from different parts of the Middle East, women's rights activists, labor activists, to put pressure on these different corporate and civil society entities to drop out of the G20, and then as a consequence, put pressure on the Saudi monarchy between now and November to say, we don't want this controversy following us into November. Let's put down as much baggage as possible. Let's try to wrap up the Yemen war. Let's release the women's rights activists who are in prison. Let's reform our migrant labor abuses and abusive legal system. And so that's the big picture on the campaign. And I'll just take a pause right there, and maybe we can open it up for questions. I've been talking for about 20 minutes, and then I'm happy to get into some more details as well.
Well, Sunjeev, what is the Saudi strategy? In other words, what is it trying to turn itself into? That it uses the G20 and other international forums to try to accomplish in terms of, moving from an oil-based economy to a more diversified economy? What is the line that they're, what are they really trying to achieve?
I think different people will answer that question differently depending on, where you sit on the spectrum of issues and how cynical you are. I mean, I think the most charitable explanation would be that the Saudi monarchy is trying to modernize its economy, shift off of a pure oil base for its revenues, develop deeper ties in terms of global commerce, convert its oil profits into investments into non-oil industries, non-fossil fuel industries, and then more deeply integrate its population into global streams of commerce. A more cynical way of looking at it is that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is looking to build legitimacy for himself and to push behind him the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, to push behind him the other criticisms of his monarchy, and to build a sustainable future Saudi Arabia in which the people are economic participants and consumers, though not political participants. And so that's the pathway, in my opinion, here. A world in which Saudi citizens are able to work, earn money, and consume, but where the politics of the country are controlled by the monarchy and by the de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, and where challenges to his authority or calls for democratization are just ignored, shut down, and the power of the state's violence is deployed to end that.
So we have a question here. I'd like to hear thoughts on how Saudi Arabia has modernized in the last 5 years, looking at their oil market predictions around Vision 2030 and how they're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's a bunch of things there, as well as what is the U.S.-Saudi relationship really all about?
Yeah, that's a lot. So I will say I'm not an energy expert or an energy market scholar or expert, so I can't answer deep questions about the nature of the Saudi energy sector. At a superficial level, I'll say that it seems that the Saudi monarchy has been trying to do what they would call modernize. They put out a document called Vision 2030. You can look it up. It's pretty easy to find. It's interesting because it talks about including women in the workplace. It talks about, the Saudi economy. If you do a word search for the word rights, that's nowhere in the document. So it's in keeping with the vision of a totalitarian state that wants to increase prosperity and more deeply integrate its people into the global economy without giving up any control over the state politically. So that's my big picture sense of it. A lot of that, though, has been shelved or put on hold because the Saudi monarchy is dealing with a bit of a fiscal crisis. They are raising, my understanding is they're raising the VAT, the value-added tax on their citizens. They're scaling back a lot of their ambitions for new infrastructure. This has to do with oil prices falling and loss of revenue there. It has to do with the reckless choices of the Saudi crown prince in terms of the war in Yemen, which has been very expensive for them, even as it's cost many thousands of people their lives. And so the future is unclear. There's a woman, Madawi al-Rashid, who is a prominent Saudi scholar who lives in the UK, and she has written a piece recently that's worth checking out about the deal ending between the Saudi state and the people, where the deal used to be, play by the rules, keep your head down, and you will be taken care of by the state with its revenues and wealth. And that second half is now sort of in question as to whether or not the state can do that. So that's kind of where things stand right now. The question of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, I think it probably depends on where one sits. A lot of companies turn to the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the PIF, as a source of revenue, as a source of investment. So, for example, the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, which is the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, they have a seat on the board of directors of Uber because they are, I think, a 5% shareholder of Uber. They have investments in many other companies. So there's that piece of it. Saudi Arabia is the largest customer for U.S. arms sales. So there's that piece of it. I think if you are a global hegemon or attempting to maintain global power, you probably want the major oil exporters on your side, regardless of the cost to human life. And so those who look at the world as a chessboard in national security circles want to keep the Saudi monarchy and other oil monarchies close to the U.S. And so I think that's probably the big picture. That's how I see it. I'm open to other perspectives, though.
Yeah, well, could you talk about, you've been working on this project of trying to get various institutions to to end their relationship with the Saudis, to not participate in these international forums. Can you give us a few examples of some things that you've been doing over the last couple of years along those lines? Yeah,
so with each of the engagement groups, there are opportunities to push. So if you go to the W20, the Women 20, there you go. It's open. Actually, probably a better one is here. There we go. So a major, it's going to take a second to come up because I'm using two internet. Here we go. So one campaign that we've kicked off is to call on members of the W20, which are a network of women from around the world, to end their silence on the imprisonment of women activists in Saudi Arabia, and to say that they won't attend until that is addressed. And there are 4 or 5, business and professional leaders from multiple countries, each country, that are attending. And so there's an opportunity to kind of put a little pressure on them, for the women in the United States who are attending as W20 delegates from the US to call on them to back out until they take a stand on freeing women activists in Saudi Arabia. There's another angle, which is to target the business entities that are the thought leaders under the B20. They are the thought leaders and thought partners to the G20 to back out and to present them with a set of demands that include women's rights, ending the war in Yemen, ending support for extremist groups, supporting democracy, ending interventions against democracy. And so those are the campaigns that we're rolling out right now. And, I'd love to have, the partnership of the Raytheon campaign folks and others in Massachusetts Peace Action around this work as well.
So have you actually gotten groups to back out in the past of some of these international forums?
So we've just started this campaign on the W20. One of the U.S. delegates has backed out. Her name's Lyric Thompson. She is with the International Center. It's a policy group focused on women's issues around the world. There are 3 other delegates that we've sent them a formal letter to call on them to back out, and now we're going to be moving into the realm of public campaigning, so that
Oops, you just froze on us.
start feeling greater and greater rounds of public pressure. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me now? All right, great. All right. So between now and November is the time to take the statements and the demands and to start putting pressure on the specific companies and entities, the consulting firms, the Women 20 delegates, U.S. mayors, all of those different pieces of the work.
Got a question here that someone says that they'd like to get the specifics on the article on the Saudi families no longer being able to keep up with the agreement with its people. Did you mention a particular article that was on that?
Yeah, let me just find that right now while we're talking.
While you're looking, is that W20 group, the Women 20 group, is that under the management of Saudi Arabia, or is that somewhat independent?
So that's the funny thing about all this. The participants are independent, but all of the groups are staffed by the Saudi monarchy and it's deputized, and that doesn't make them wholly illegitimate. So for example, there are some women advocates who are, in a sense, staffing the W20 from Saudi Arabia. But what they can say is limited, of course, right? They can't call for the freedom of imprisoned women's rights activists. They have to do a more gentle engagement as sort of subjects of the monarchy. In other cases, it seems like it's sort of the staffing is sort of less principled, less substantive, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We able to find that book?
Give me just a second here. Go ahead. Happy to take some more questions.
Given the somewhat severe financial crisis going on with Saudi Arabia, mainly because of oil, what impacts do you see that having on the war in Yemen? Is there any sense that the Saudis are considering getting out?
So they seem to have made motions in that direction, but it's always difficult to sort of guess what the sincerity of it is. They announced a unilateral kind of one-sided temporary ceasefire that the Houthi rebel groups didn't agree to, and then that fell apart. But my sense is that the next 5 months offer our community the greatest leverage that we'll have on the behavior of the Saudi monarchy and the U.S. alliance, and that's for 2 reasons. One, the G20, or 3. One, the G20. 2, the economic crisis they're facing, and then 3, the lack of knowledge on their part about what happens if Trump's not reelected. Right? Their whole relationship with the U.S. is dependent on Trump and Kushner. They've lost the Democrats for now, and if it weren't for Trump, multiple arms sales would have already been blocked. Most of Trump's vetoes have been on Yemen or Iran in terms of stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And so if we collectively as a community organize effectively, we have an opportunity in the next 5 months between now and November to really set the stage for a shift in the U.S.-Saudi alliance, both by pushing these issues forward right now and forcing the Saudis to make concessions, but then also by making sure that if there's a change in leadership in the U.S., that they can't go back to business as usual, right? The old way of like the U.S. and Saudi is sort of, reliable geopolitical partners isn't available as an option. And that means that we push Congress, we push these corporate entities, we push civil society participants, and then we create a shift in climate that even after Trump is gone, if he's gone, if the current polling numbers hold true, we have a long ways to go. A potential President Biden can't just say, okay, Mohammed bin Salman, just sort of calm down, release a few people, let's go back to business as usual. So there's a real unique opportunity for all of us right now on that front.
Is there a structural confluence of interest, though, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia right now in terms of Iran? Doesn't that kind of keep the U.S. Alliance with Saudi Arabia going to some degree?
I think there's a structural alliance between the neoconservative community. These are all overlapping, of course, they're not separate, but like neoconservative, pro-Israel, and right-wing hawks in government, the Trump administration with regards to Iran, right? Like, in my opinion, Israel needs an enemy to justify U.S. support for Israel and also to shrink the focus on Palestinian suffering. And so, having Iran as a projected hostile, enemy is useful for them. It's useful for those who want to keep U.S. military budgets high and to keep the U.S. anchored in the Middle East, whether they are American foreign policy planners or arms lobbyists or, Middle Eastern governments. But I would expect that you'd have a shift away from the current level of U.S.-Iran hostility if Biden comes into power because of the history of the Obama-Iran nuclear deal and a desire by those left of center to move back towards that and to de-escalate the U.S.-Iran sort of whatever you want to call it, conflict, hostility, that sort of thing. So that's another piece of this as well. That's an opportunity for all of us.
So one area that hasn't gotten a lot of discussion lately is this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism. Is that spread of that brand of Islam still taking place? Are there particular countries where it's significant? Obviously, it was very significant in Afghanistan. What is the status? Has Saudi Arabia started to back off of its evangelical approach to Wahhabism?
That is one area where MBS has been described. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, has been described as sort of shifting things and breaking away from the historic kind of deal between the monarchy and the clerics of, we stay in power, we fund you to preach your strand of Islam, and everything sort of stays the same. And that's one area where it's been described that it's been said that MBS has broken away from that a little bit and into this sort of more kind of centralized power where he's in charge. I think that there's a real opportunity here, if it's done right, to challenge the Saudi monarchy and the U.S.-Saudi alliance in the context of their ideological exports and the context of their, entanglements with Al-Qaeda and extremist groups. So, for example, when ISIS came to power for the period of time that it was in power, before they could print their own textbooks, they used Saudi textbooks because they found that to be a good fit for them. The challenge, though, is, Muslim Americans and Muslims in the diaspora are facing, extraordinary hostility from, conservative forces that want to demonize Muslims. And so there's a great wariness around criticism of the Saudi monarchy through the lens of its version of Islam, because that's used also to delegitimize the practices of Muslims in the U.S. and can quickly slide into Islamophobia. So it takes some skill to do this right. And one way to do this right is to start any conversation by highlighting the Muslim reformers inside Saudi Arabia who have been shut down, imprisoned, and even killed because they have put forward a vision of politics and human rights and democracy anchored in Islam, which is a threat to the state ideology that Islam means, you know, an absolute ruler, and you know, following that, and obeying an absolute divine ruler. You know, there was a Saudi cleric very recently, if you Google it, you'll find it, that said that protests are against Islam, right? That's the state, that is the state doctrine, right? It's the divine right of kings, you know, which we know from the European context, right? Monarchs, you know, the first goal of maintaining a monarch's power is to build the ideology that makes that the only way to be. So what I want to show just for a second here is a quick article about a man named let me see here. How do I share my screen? There we go. Take a second here. There we go. So you may have seen the story of Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid, who was a Saudi dissident who, you know, as the New York Times headline says, died in detention. He was a political reformer who advocated for democracy and human rights, and made the explicit argument that those freedoms were anchored in Islam. He had an interpretation of Islam that limited the power of the state, and that said that the state had obligations to the people. So that is, of course, a threat to the notion of the divine right of kings or absolute monarchy. And he was arrested. He'd been arrested many times in his life. And in his last round of arrest, he was given a long multi-year sentence. You know, as you can see from the text, you know, he advocated for a constitutional monarchy and independent judiciary. And he died. He had a stroke in recent months. He was, while in prison, he was sort of left in the prison cell after the stroke for many hours, and then moved to a hospital later, and then he died sometime after that in a hospital. And he's one of many examples of how the Saudi monarchy has imprisoned or killed human rights reformers. Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid was called by Jamal Khashoggi the Saudi Mandela, and Jamal Khashoggi sort of mused out loud that he wondered why his case just wasn't more widely known. I think in part it's the barrier of language. There just isn't enough Arabic to English translation that's happening. And so many people in the West don't know about the individuals who are advocating for reform in Saudi Arabia. Some of it's American media bias, but we can challenge the ideology of the Saudi state by highlighting and centering the cases of those who have been imprisoned and killed by the Saudi monarchy for advocating for human rights, and anchoring that in an alternate vision of Islam that the Saudi state does not want to have heard. So that's my kind of long-winded answer to the question of how to deal with the state and Wahhabism and its particular ideologies.
Well, just building off that a little bit, there have been some articles on the connections that Saudi Arabia has with various institutions in this country, that kind of puts a damper on people willing to criticize it, and also the monitoring of Saudi students in the United States. Have you?
Yeah.
Is there any specific information that you have about that?
I don't have specific information on the monitoring, but it's generally understood that, you know, all Saudi students who are on fellowships, you know, face significant risks if they speak out, and so that's why they don't, you know, because they or their families back home can suffer significantly. The question of Saudi funding for, you know, Islamic centers or other institutions, or centers in schools or universities, that's a real one. I don't know the exact level to which these donations are made, but both the Saudi monarchy and the UAE monarchy have spent a good bit of money funding schools, funding universities. NYU has a memorandum of understanding with the UAE, the United Arab Emirates monarchy, that they won't make public. And in all likelihood, the UAE is handing a lot of cash to NYU. Saudi monarchy, my understanding, has made contributions through its, you know, philanthropic arms to different centers. And that does kind of create a difficult tension, you know, in terms of delegitimizing a brutal monarchy versus the challenge of communities that may benefit from some aspect of its funding to some aspect of their like civil society institutions. There isn't any real easy way, I think, to deal with that other than to, I think, focus on the core questions of who the Saudi monarchy is oppressing back home. Whether it's the story of Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid or others, there's a group called ACPRA, the Association for Civil and Political Rights, whose leaders are, civil society, human rights advocates in Saudi Arabia. Many, if not all of them, have been given multi-year prison sentences. And we can center their stories, and there are plenty of Muslim allies in the United States who also agree. And I think, broadly speaking, what I understand is that there are different degrees of shifts in terms of Muslim diasporas in the United States. I'm not Muslim, so I'm not in the communities, in these conversations, but there are greater and greater comfort with being critical of the Saudi monarchy because of Yemen, because of so many other things.
Right. So in terms of your campaign, the G20, is that your pretty much the exclusive campaign right now? Are there other international forums or whatever that you're trying to get people to dissociate themselves from?
I think the G20 offers the most opportunity because you've got the U20, the Urban 20, which are the mayors going to the G20. You've got the B20, the business groups. You've got the W20 women's delegates. And I think if we built a strong campaign right there, that's the real opportunity. And it gives a lot of us something that we can take into our communities to call on them to change their behavior. So
if people who are watching tonight would be interested in helping out on this campaign, what types of steps are you asking people to take?
Well, what would be great would be if there were a handful of folks from the community who are up for sort of playing a coordinator role, and then we can pull together folks from across the U.S. and maybe beyond for a kind of activist network that starts raising up some demands. Freedom Forward will put forward. We're going to have like the basic letters people can sign on to, online actions, things like that. But then there's also an opportunity to do all of the things that everyone here is so good at, public protests, local opinion pieces, phone calls. There are ways to really get creative here, because at the end of the day, these institutions, the businesses, the organizations, they're populated by people. And, once these management consultants start getting called out, there's a lot of opportunity ahead of us. So what I'd love to do is if folks on this call are interested, is to set up a coordinating call, and then to bring in people from other communities in the U.S. that you're already networked with. And then we can, between now and November, really start scaling up some demands and campaigns and start putting pressure on the folks that are on the wrong side of this issue.
Are there letters, petitions right now that people can sign focused on some of these groups?
Yeah, there are, and I'll send to you I don't know what the easiest ways to do this. I can post them in the chat if that's easy.
Sure.
That'll take me just a second here. I can also email them to you afterwards if you want to email it out to everybody who's RSVP'd. That might be probably the most organized way to do it.
Yeah, that'd be good to put it in the chat.
Okay.
We have a question here asking whether you coordinate at all with Code Pink, because this seems to be something, given their focus on Saudi Arabia, it seems to be something that they would participate in. Yeah, definitely. I've been working with Code Pink on some of the women's issues and other pieces of it. I think the bulk of the work is ahead of us, the organizing, the kind of taking things out off of my laptop and off of a web page and into people's hands. That's ahead of all of us. But yeah, I've been talking to Code Pink and other groups too. Great.
Paul, it looks like Roz Windsor has something to say.
Can you open it up for her, or is she?
Okay, Roz, you're up.
Roz, you're muted.
Very good. I wonder if there is a list of the mayors who expect to go.
There is. Well, there's a list of the there's a list of the cities and mayors that went when for the Tokyo G20. You know, my guess is that no one's actually going to go this year, but that doesn't mean that we can't launch campaigns. That's too many negatives in that sentence. I'm confusing myself. We should definitely launch campaigns now, calling on them to drop out of the Urban 20, the U20, which is the mayor's group to the G20, until the Saudi monarchy, you know, meets our demands.
Okay,
So let
so
me
Mayor,
post.
so the mayor of Boston could be a target.
This is the list. Let me show you. I'll paste it in the chat right now. And actually, maybe I'll just actually share the screen so you can see. So you can see from the screen the cities that were part of the Urban 20 from the U.S. in the past are Chicago, Houston, LA, and New York.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that they have some like, you know, associate for diplomatic and cultural or commerce and culture in the mayor's offices that like has a file with some invitation for the Urban 20 from Saudi Arabia, but that right now everyone's super focused on the pandemic and the massive protests against police brutality, and that this kind of thing is not something any of them really wants to be seen as focused on, you know, going to Saudi Arabia or the G20, right? That's just not on. So, but I think it's an easy I think they're easier targets now to put pressure on to get them to say something that they're not doing this. You know, they're not going to participate.
Okay, Sanjeev, so are you putting this information in the chat, whatever you can there?
I think it'd be easier if it's all right with you if I put it all together in an email, because it'll be a little bit scattered. There's a lot of different
We
things.
can send that to people that are
Yeah.
on the,
Mhm.
yeah, okay. And one last thing, just, do you know what the story is with the pandemic in Saudi Arabia?
There are a few things going on. The big one is that the Saudi monarchy has, I don't know the details as to what the level of it is. I remember reading that many, that the royal family had that there were cases among the royal family, and they'd all sort of gone into hiding early on. They also have criminalized spreading rumors about COVID, which of course could easily be used to stop whistleblowers or independent non-governmental comments about it. But that's the limit of what I know at this time.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Sanjeev. We will send out that information to people. And, you know, of course, we're focused on one particular company and its connections with Saudi Arabia. We would like very much our pressure on Raytheon to have some type of impact of Raytheon communicating to the Saudis that destroying Yemen like this is not good for their company and all that. Meanwhile, we get a chance to do a lot of education around Raytheon and its tremendous influence that it has with nonprofits such as the Girl Scouts, the Walk for Hunger, so many of these different projects that people consider quite wonderful are getting massive support from Raytheon, which is making a lot of the money off those weapon sales. Right now, for instance, Raytheon is making the bombs that are being used to bomb Yemen in Saudi Arabia itself with a joint venture that the president set up there. And you know, we focus on not just the weapons that Saudi Arabia is making, but also diplomatic pressure.
I signed up like a generic thing when they call me.
Big companies like Saudi Arabia are exercising over U.S. foreign policy. For instance, Raytheon's lobbyists work together with the Secretary of Defense, who used to be the top Raytheon lobbyist, Esper. He's now our Secretary of Defense. They worked together to make sure that the amendment, which would have ended U.S. involvement with with the war in Yemen, with Saudi Arabia, to make sure that that amendment that was part of the military budget was removed from the military budget. So both behind the scenes and in terms of weapons and in terms of its long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia, Raytheon has hundreds of employees there. It trains members of the Saudi military. The connections are quite extensive. So what we'd like to do is invite people to join the, excuse me for this phone, I can't turn it off right now. It'll stop in a second. We'd like to invite people to join the Raytheon campaign. We will be sending information out about how to do that. And if anyone thinks you might be interested in joining with us, we have a lot of rallies, and we write letters. We do all kinds of very interesting activities. We have a great group of people. If you'd like to get involved with us, write that in the chat and we'll get back to you. But I do want to mention this specific rally on Saturday, which is at the South Bay Shopping Center in Dorchester. The rally springs from a quote by Raytheon's man in the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, who back during the crisis when Trump was walking to the church to hold up the Bible, he said, "I think the sooner that you mass and dominate the battle space, the quicker this dissipates, and we can get back to the right normal." So a lot of Americans protesting in the streets right now are getting a taste of what it's like, a little bit of a taste at least, to what it's like to live in a battle space, whereas the people of Yemen have been living in that battle space for quite a long time now. Our participants on this program are used to the information about the famine in Yemen, 10 million people living on the brink of famine, over 1 million cases of cholera, so many children killed, the infrastructure destroyed, all with the help of this company, Raytheon, its weapons and its diplomatic support. So this Saturday at 1 o'clock at the South Bay Shopping Center, at the area of the shopping center near Target, we will be massing to insist that Raytheon end this deadly relationship with Saudi Arabia and that it stops selling weapons to the Saudis. And would certainly invite everyone to join us over in Dorchester. It's just from 1 to 2. We will be wearing masks, of course. We will be standing 6 feet apart for safety. And we'd really like a good turnout this Saturday. The other last announcement I'll make is that the Mass Peace Action Middle East Working Group invites people who are interested in working on these wars in the Middle East, trying to end them, trying to prevent new wars, trying to deal with the tremendous tension that exists between the United States and Iran right now, trying to deal with the war in Yemen, trying to end the war in Afghanistan. The list goes on and on, of course. And we would invite you to join our working group. We meet every 3 or 4 weeks to plan our activities. And we have a really good group of people, and obviously the work itself is very important. So with that said, I don't see any other questions here. Sunjeev, we want to thank you very much for joining us, for giving us all that information. And let's see what types of collaboration are possible in the future to end this U.S.-Saudi alliance.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to chat with everybody. I'm looking forward to next steps. I think there's a lot of opportunities ahead for us right now.
Terrific. Good night now. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Good night.